Yes, I'm of course, I'll have to move out of this light. I'm very pleased to be here and very grateful to Jos for being so original in thinking up the idea to bring me here and run this 5-day seminar. They're great people here, and I have a graduate student who's become the chair of his own department at Pitcher College, who's written a book on Denmark based on 15 months here. The title of the book is Society Without God, and it's been translated in 7 languages, and he's been raving about the place for years. So it's really nice when you reach an age. It's not that you gain so much knowledge, but that all your teachers have died, and you're the only one left standing. that you open up your emails, and instead of spam coming from China and Brazil and Argentina and Denmark and Switzerland, you get invitations, right? And so I was really excited when the Danish one came, because I had that in the back of my mind to see what my student was raving about. And so far the people are terrific. It's nice how you can run a society without taking your rules too seriously, and yet the rules work. I mean, it's quite an adventure. I think I will steal this as a lectern. I've been, in most of my projects, I've been looking at the same kind of phenomenon. I'm a, let's say, congenital phenomenologist. And so I've been very interested in the problem of how humans use formal analytic thinking. That is, what is the role of logic, philosophy, reason in the broadest sense? I mean, we're called Homo sapiens sapiens, right? Hey, sapiens, of course, means to know. It comes from the Latin sapere, which means to know. So we are the hominids that we think so much. The scientists have given us thinking twice in our name, right? And we're trying our best to live up to it. And we're developing these tools for thinking, and it struck me long ago, probably when I started reading Husserl's Crisis of the European Sciences, that we haven't learned enough about how to think, that we're on the way, but the evolution of the capacity to think and the capacity to know what reason is capable of doing and what reason is not capable of doing is something that we need to really seriously do some research on. And so I took up a project of studying formal analytic reasoning among Tibetan Buddhist monks, which was very interesting. I've spent many years in monasteries, and I'm not about to take ordination, but they practice a medieval form of scholastic research that is very rigorous. And so I filmed their formal debates and analyzed what good formal analysis does in their debating, how it helps them to think carefully and rigorously and produce objective knowledge, but also at the same time how it also constrains what they think and what they have access to. That is, it narrows down according to the way it regularizes their thinking. So the question is, in a phenomenological language, how do you remain open to what it is you don't know when we're all experts at what we know? And as I said a couple days ago, that you can't even get the grant unless you tell them exactly what it is you're going to find out. That you have to know not just your hypotheses, but you have to really convince the board that you're going to come up with something, and that means you need to know. And so how do you discover? Garfinkel used to talk about what is research as a discovering science. So I'm interested in looking at reason, but as an ethnomethodologist, I'm not satisfied with just reading philosophy. And so I've taken up studies of people using formalization of their inquiries to assist them in doing rigorous inquiries and looking at what people are doing. You can't see this at the bottom maybe, but it says professional methods for making coffee taste descriptors objective. I mean, what is professionalism? What is science? What is objectivity? These are all the general questions that frame my work. I recently applied for a grant at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they wanted to know, well, why is this a humanities? Why isn't this, why don't you go to NSF, or why don't you go to some social science? And so I explained it something like this, I used several illustrations, and one of them was I've been through 2 very serious heart surgeries, and I've got a wonderful cardiologist, and I've known him for about 15 years now, and he's the last time I was in his office last July, he said, "Ken, you're a sociologist. Maybe you can help me with this problem I've got. I'm increasingly required to administer a computer-generated questionnaire, set of questions, for each heart patient I have. And especially it's critical for elderly patients to determine whether or not they're a reasonable risk at that age to go through a serious heart surgery." And I find myself, when the patients, these, let's say, 78-year-old people are here in the room and I'm diagnosing them, I'm over here at the computer and I don't even maintain eye contact with them. I'm stuck on the computer answering all these questions, and the computer's generating the answer whether or not, and of course, the hospitals are businesses, the insurance companies are businesses, and they want this kind of standardization, and they buy into the objectivism that rigorous quantification of these important questions can offer them the assurance that the answer will be the right one. And he said, it's useful to a point, but I want to spend more time with the eyes of the patient. You can sometimes tell who's going to make it. He said, I've been doing this a long time. I have a pretty good clue myself as to who's going to make it and who isn't going to make it. So this is just one prototype of how these fabulous logarithms and computer-generated systems of analysis help us. I mean, surely they made the world more productive. We couldn't have reached, 8 billion or 7 billion? We couldn't have reached this many people without them. But they're very problematic for this Homo sapiens sapiens that's evolving along with it. And I noticed in the news last night, I don't know if people heard the news, but they came out with their report in San Francisco of the major flight crash of airplane crash of Flight 214 that crashed in the approach to the San Francisco airport. I think touched the bay before they made the runway. This was last summer, and they did thorough research, and they determined that the problem was that the pilots were relying too much on computers. And they came up with a name, the people that wrote the report, they called it automation addiction. Okay. So of course, the flight capacity, the ability of the computers to assist planes landing in thick fog, you don't want to not use them, but we need to learn how to use them in the right way. There's a wonderful Indian thinker by the name of Aurobindo, who was a freedom fighter. He was actually grew up in Calcutta and was educated in England. He's really an Englishman, but he came to detest Britain's role in India and led the part of the resistance in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And he wrote this early book. He said, we need to submit everything to the great Congress of Reason, but after they've given their advice, we have to reserve for ourselves the final decision and consent, so that we want the information. That's very much what the coffee tasters are telling me. One coffee taster says, I want to know all the information and I want to know all the numbers, but I don't feel under an obligation to be directed by them. I'll make the decision. Okay. And if I could wax phenomenological, Husserl's basic insight is that we need that truth is our basic, original, intuitive experience of what is the case. And to reduce truth to a logarithmic process that generates by itself, independently of our ability to think and be aware, is a mistake. And that's what the crisis of the European sciences is about, that great late book of Husserl's. And of course, Husserl started ethnomethodology's most important idea, and that is that you have to take what's immediately presented to you and begin with that. Although some people in ethnomethodology will add begin with it and end with it. Don't go, just stick with what you have in your imminent, that's close-up experience, okay? He calls that the principle of principles. Whereas we get trained in these methodologies and we're so good at them. And the problem, Garfinkel would say, is not that we're not good at the methodologies, it's that we're too good at the methodologies. We don't miss the point in any which way. We miss the point according to the specific methods that we're skilled in. That's what blinds us. And that's very much what Husserl is talking about in The Crisis. And it was Garfinkel who insisted that we read that. So it's an important long-term, I'm explaining to the National Endowment for Humanities, this is a broad philosophical anthropological question that has lots of consequences. For example, why are all the tomatoes tasteless in the United States? They're producing great tomatoes, they're even square, so they can pack more of them, right? And they're the right color, because people look for color, but you can't find, it's like styrofoam, right? Our participant and colleague Getz Huppe has done fascinating research on astronomers, which he shared a bit of with us, and he reports that astronomers mistrust automation. And one of his informants explained to him, you always need to use your knowledge to verify what you're doing, right? I mean, that's you don't want to sell the story. You want to use the techniques. And so I turned to the coffee industry, and I want to look at how do they use the techniques. Let me have a sip. Let it be said, let it be known that the fellow who came to talk about coffee tasting would not drink any more of the coffee sold downstairs. I can't find the coffee there. And I'm not that particular, I never thought. Anyway, maybe I'm becoming more. I tried it twice. Anyway, there's a tension. I mean, what's an issue for us, theoretically, is a practical issue for people in the coffee industry. There's a tension in the coffee industry, as there is probably through any industry that uses standardization and formal procedures. And that is, how much do we rely on these objective methods, and which objective methods, and is it a matter of just getting the methods better? Those objective methods were bad, but now they're better. And of course, there's all this great software, as there is everywhere else, and there's companies promoting the software, and people are eager for shortcuts. But what's wonderful about professional coffee tasters is that they're spending so much money trying to locate what flavor their clients are coming to them to buy, and so much money buying that coffee in Brazil, Indonesia, India, etc., that they can't blow $500,000 on an order that's wrong. So if the programs aren't working, that's too expensive for them. So they need an objectivity that is actually successful. They need to find the tastes that are promoting the interest of their product among their clients. So that means that they're less inclined to adopt the ideology of objectivity, although there's some of that too, and more inclined to look for real objectivity. And so it becomes a very perspicuous case for us. And so I've gone around to Central America and Brazil and India and Italy, Pacific Northwest, a few other places, and filmed coffee tasters, professional coffee tasters, tasting coffee to find out what is this work. And this work amounts to a number of things, which we're going to review now. But it mostly consists of developing categories of flavor using precise descriptors, adjectives, that describe tastes. And these descriptors have to be standardized enough so that the guy buying the coffee in Brazil is tasting the same flavor that they want in Trieste. But this precision is a very strange thing. That is, the tasters really demand precision, but how they actually get it is an ethnographic problem for me. It's not only a problem for me, it's a problem for the coffee tasters. It's fascinating that, and I want to begin by reviewing some of the ironies that they're engaged in this part of their life in getting this precise taste of coffee. But because they're also interested in this topic, they're available for really meaningful discussions, tutorials, collaborations, and everything that I've learned has come at the hands of professional tasters who have the same questions that I have. And of course, there's some pressure in there looking at me perhaps for some solutions, or at least maybe better methodologies. Okay. One document in an Italian publication in the coffee industry is that they're after a procedure rigoroso, elaborato e rispettate proprio per ottenere uno standard qualitativo certo e dimostrabile, which means a rigorous procedure, okay, elaborated, and I hope I have this right, with proper respect for obtaining a certain and demonstrable qualitative standard, okay? This is what I would call a prayer. I mean, this is their dream, right? And it's probably, it's kind of like when it kind of indicates a bit of insecurity, actually. Especially I find it in the use of English there. Why is English more objective in Italy than Italian? Why do they do procedure rigorosa? That's better. There must be an Italian word for procedure, right? What would it be?
I think say procedura.
Something similar.
And also standard, right? I mean, if you're wanting to be objective, maybe there is more oats in English for it than in other languages. But they're very serious about that, and it's their seriousness and the success that they have that I'm interested in describing and identifying and studying. Similarly, another Italian taster told me in English, our job as tasters is to be as objective as possible in defining the attributes that characterize the coffee we're tasting. Okay. Or as objective as possible about something that's subjective. So there's an irony in the work, but that irony doesn't remove the need for objectivity because so much money's at stake and people's good coffee's at stake. Professional tasters wonderfully are tenacious in resisting the alienation that comes from subordinating yourself to a system. They all adopt systems, but they're all critical. They don't like them, they don't trust them, they insist that they don't give everything that's needed, and yet they use them because they do some good. But it's this resistance that comes from the need to be really objective in identifying the taste that's in a cup of coffee. That is, it's a demand of their profession that they cultivate an originality that allows them to continually break through the limits of their understanding and the limits of their methodology. Their methodology can get them only so far. Any descriptor that they agree upon that describes the flavor in a cup of coffee, they know, these tasters know that that coffee is always something more than what those descriptors can capture. Even when those descriptors are adequate enough to send the guy to Brazil to find that bean and come back with it. Still, there's more in that coffee than their descriptors define. And so there's a natural humility. And professional tasters have been wrong enough that there's just a serious humility. They're really great people to work with. They have a practical need to resist standardization and use standardization at the same time. So there's these ironies that are really fascinating. While the coffee industry's developed diverse methods and protocols for objective tasting, all gustatory experience remains subjective. But this subjective tasting must be made objective in order to be useful. And it can even be said here that objectivity here is a necessary impossibility. Now, the response I got from the National Endowment for Humanities, you must have made a mistake in this paragraph, right? This is impossible. You can't have a necessary impossibility. If it's impossible, it can't be necessary. But that's the situation that they're facing. They have to know objectively what the taste is in this coffee here. And yet it's impossible to get it completely objective. If coffee people want it both ways, it's because they need it both ways. So that's the first irony. And it's very much the basis of the tension that inhabits the world's coffee industry. Many tasters stressed that the importance of when you taste is to taste alone. If you want objectivity, you don't want to be influenced by other tasters. So you need to come down and fill out your tasting schedules and fill in the bubbles for all the categories all by yourself. And yet, in 10 minutes later, they'll tell you that you've got to do it with other people because no one tongue can capture all the taste that's in the cup. So it has to be a collaborative activity, and every factory of coffee has 2 or 3 tasters working together, and almost every day they're going down the hall and dragging in, you know, Sylvia and Jorge to come in and taste too. What do you think? You know, we're stumped on this one. So you need, for the objectivity, you need to taste individually, and you also need to taste together. So there's a conflict there in the advice, and even in a very important book on wine tasting, Émile Peinot's The Taste of Wine. It's in French, and there's a very good English translation. In one page, he says, you've got to taste alone, and another page, he says, you've got to taste with other people. So there's the second irony then. A third irony is that those who would like to use numeration strategies to help them explore the flavors simultaneously employ intuitive and qualitative measures as they do so. Very interesting. Which are necessary for rendering the enumeration strategies pertinent. While those who refuse, and sometimes they're obstinate in their refusal, especially in India, to rely on numeration protocols, almost always end up employing some quantitative methods in their work. So it's not like you've got the qualitative against the quantitative. They're both doing both. So that makes the debate a very peculiar one. Finally, taste descriptors are used to locate the taste in a cup. And you need the descriptors to find that taste, because, you know, if I'm interested in let's say, this is fruity. What is fruity? Well, fruity is a label that you put on the top of your tongue goes into the cup, and what it finds becomes fruity. But there's different fruities with different coffees. There's a lot of fruity coffees now. The new Ethiopians and Kenyans that they find, you know, are wonderfully fruity. But they're different fruities. And so, if you go in concerned about fruit, you might miss smooth, you might miss vanilla. So you're very much using the language to make your discoveries, but as it opens up one area, it's closing off the other areas. And professional coffee tasters have this fundamental problem, and that is, how do you taste with flexibility? How do you keep your mind clear for the next cup? Not just because your tongue's saturated with the previous coffee flavor, and you have a few crackers and then you do the next cup, but because your head is filled with not just a certain selection of coffee descriptors as opposed to others, but a certain meaning for that occasion of fruity and smooth and whatever other flavors that you're dealing with. And you know, it's just like in the meeting in Freiburg, Christian Heath raised a great question at this point. He said, isn't that just like the way we grade papers? I mean, you've got your big stack. Your goal is to not be late for the holiday family reunion, and you know, you're going through the stack, and you have a particular criteria that you're developing, and you notice by exam 50, by essay 50, that somehow your standards have been stretched. And you realize that you're not applying the same standard system of evaluation to every paper. And so if you're really diligent, you'll go back to the beginning and reread them, applying the mature standard to the early ones, right? Maybe. But that's like the coffee tasters. So how do you keep the mind clear? What is openness? How do we use rigor in formal thinking in the right way, and at the same time keep us open to what we need to know most, which is what we don't know? and what we need to learn. So the major focus of this very central aspect of the research is how does a batch of coffee, how does its taste get settled? And that is the most interesting thing in the world. I just love figuring out, watching how people settle the taste of a batch of coffee. Now, I like to explain the problem like this. And this, in a rough way, follows from some of the diagrams that Garfinkel would put up. There's the taste of the cup of coffee, and the taste is something real. You know, we're not making it up. There is taste, well, most coffees anyway. There is taste in the coffee, and that's really objective. That's a real objectivity that can be experienced. But then there's these huge methodical procedures, and every country has a different way to do it. Some people use numeration, other people don't. Some people do it, with a certain number of cups. You've got to have standardization of temperatures and soaking times and grinds, and I mean it's not an easy matter. In fact, I tried to do it. I couldn't get the standardization, so we've gone to using these pods like Nespresso and Lavazza and all these people, because you get that standardization pre-made. But anyway, there's a lot of work going into the methods, and they vary quite a lot from one country to the other. And then the result of that method is what the coffee tasters speak to each other of as the taste. And I'll show you in just a second a couple of examples of people talking about the taste. It tastes like wood. It tastes like cedar wood, right? That might be, but that taste is an objectivity because it results from a very elaborate methodology that involves rigorous analysis according to various categories that are given numbers, and the spot on the bubble form is filled out, and you average the scores, and you also have some, they admit there's some role for subjectivity, so you have some written descriptions, and then you get the talk of the coffee tasters actually settling what is this coffee. It's very important. Even the small roasters, Joost has promised to put me in touch with a roaster in Uns, who, they can't roast and not taste what they're roasting to see if they get it right. And so they have to figure out exactly what is this right? And one of the top exporting companies in Brazil, the head taster emphasized to me, there's no right taste. There's no best taste. There's only the taste the customer wants. But you have to be tasting to do that. And so they're all tasting, but the tasting involves a methodology, and by the time you get to this methodologically derived objectivity, it's something different than the real objectivity that's always going to exceed the descriptors, or however you define. And it's a big problem. Let me show you how big a problem it can be, and that is let's see if I can. The problem of communicating taste is this complicated. You have the coffee growers. They're growing the coffee, and they're very unsophisticated about the flavors of coffee. They're growing coffee, they're drinking coffee, they'll drink practically anything, has been my experience. And they really need to be taught which coffees are going to receive the highest prices. But the intermediaries, let's say the agents, the buyers, they are buying the coffee from the growers and they're selling it to the exporters. And the exporters are tasting the samples that they bring in and saying, yes, we'll have that, no, we won't have that. So they have to, but before they can't be tasting all day long every single coffee. They have to ask, well, what's the coffee like? We're looking for florals. Floral flavors are very big this year, and we have a big demand for them. And of course they say, oh, I've got a floral flavor here. Well, what kind of floral? So you're communicating what the flavor is to the next step, and the exporters then have a tremendous problem communicating to the importers what flavors they have. And the importers want particular flavors, and especially they don't want coffee that has taints, coffee that's had fermentations and pukey tastes, which happens a lot. And of course these importers are in New York and Geneva, and they're absolutely paranoid that somebody in Brazil is going to try to stick a batch of this lousy coffee inside the shipment, right? So they have these methods of putting these long arms to go in at random and getting several sections of the shipment, and then they have their tasters taste. But you have then you have arguments. Then the tasters for the importing firms have to taste it and decide what's good and what's bad, and they have to, their good and bad has to correspond to the good and bad for the exporters. They either say, yes, you've got it, or no, you haven't got it. And that means there's a tremendous problem of communication here over you need objectivity. You absolutely, why do you need it? And before I leave the slide, I mean, it goes on to the local roasters. The importers will sell to local roasters, and then the coffee consumers. Oddly enough, the two groups who know least about the flavors of coffee are the coffee consumers and the coffee growers. But it's a huge problem if you want to communicate. And the point then, if I can speak as an ethnomethodologist, the point then is that there's a need for objectivating the terms that describe the taste. You need to have objective knowledge because, not just because you're interested in truth, but there's some good sociological or social reasons to have objective knowledge. First, you can't even remember what it is you were doing. I mean, coffees get very complicated very fast. And you need to somehow identify, come up with a monothetic label for what it is you've been thinking about. So you need some objectivation to recollect yourself, and especially you need some objectivation to communicate what you found to other people, because it is a collaborative process. You need a lot of tongues to work it out in a comprehensive way. And so you have to hone people in on what it is your inquiry involves. It's no different for the astronomers. You need the objectivity to communicate what the problem is. And so you're doing, you can see the top, this work they have in providing common knowledge as part of the need to make the situation orderly. And then finally, objectivation allows you to build systems. You can have big elaborative theories only because things are objective. That is, they're written down and they have clear meanings that mean the same for everybody who is reading about them. And then you can have the very important part of science, which is peer criticism. But only when they can get on the same page. And so objectivating things at every step is a practical activity. Now, let me give you some illustrations of what we're talking about. This taster is tasting coffee. He says, I had a very distinct retronasal cinnamon aroma. Okay? Actually, in tasting, the nose is more important than the tongue. And then the second person says, I got more of a dry cocoa powder. And then he says, yeah, it's in that kind of range. Okay? I mean, they've tasted something, they tasted something in common, and now they have to provide some way to render that common flavor in an objective way in order to be useful in the industry. You know, it could be the next big thing. So, yeah, in that kind of range, and then they go back and taste some more. Oh yeah, I see that cinnamon. Not exactly cinnamon, it's more like nutmeg, you know, or something like that. Then you get, in the second case, a sort of tart grapefruit. Yeah, like maybe strawberry a little bit. Okay. Yeah, I think an unripe strawberry can be something like a grapefruit. And then at the bottom, fruity, citrus, a confirmation, yeah, but a specification, not just any fruity, but citrus, orange, and then lemon in it. And so they decide that it's lemon, and then you taste again. And then you bring Jorge from down the hall. Is it orange or lemon, right? Hopefully he won't say persimmon. He probably won't. Yes, it's lemon. But when do you stop? When do you have it adequate enough? Is an important question.
Small scale.
Wood.
Cedarwood. Cedar.
So the longer you're talking about this wood, the more I'm starting to recognize it. So if you all in favor, it's solid.
He's saying the more you're talking about the wood, the more I'm starting to recognize it. Of course, that's how understanding works. And then he specifies it's not just cedar wood, but it's sauna wood. Okay, and so they go with that.
Yeah.
But that's not a whole lot different than what professional tasters do. This is one of them. These are some of...
That beet, the right fruit, / onion, depending on how you read it.
These are some of the world's most accomplished coffee tasters. I've learned so much from these guys and gals. He says...
I don't cover the onion. I actually thought the slightly darker roast was kind of a favor, rounded that out.
So he's pointing out the effect on the flavors of the roast. You know, the goal is to catch just which level of roast is best for the given coffee, right? It's really a difficult thing because if you under roast, it tastes green and sort of herbaceous. If you over roast, it tastes bitter and black and, you know, brackish like Starbucks. You know, I'll never get into Starbucks again. But I mean, what Starbucks does is very clever. I mean, they promote all the sugar in the milk and the vanilla flavoring and the butterscotch flavoring, and people become experts at knowing which flavorings are the best and knowing what the flavorings are, so that it doesn't make any difference. Yeah, maybe this is the time to give you a few practical tips, huh? The darker the coffee is, the less caffeine there is. The caffeine goes up in the smoke of the roasting. So you want to be a man by drinking, you know, a good hard black cup of coffee, because you need the caffeine, because you have a tough day ahead. The light roast is going to have the caffeine. Okay. And it's good. The light roast is going to have all the good flavors because they won't have gone up in smoke. But it's going to have all the bad flavors too. Because one of the things about roasting a lot is all these little mistakes of fermentation that can make a coffee go putrid will get burned up. So you can buy cheap coffee, and if you roast it enough, nobody knows the difference. Right? The profit margin will be greater if you can sell them on it. And there's a lot of firms which we won't mention, that make a lot of money selling over roasted coffee.
Yeah, I just had to keep sorting it up. I mean, I just would drink this coffee all day long. And, I thought it was a honey. I thought there was a couple honey on the table. I'm not sure. I thought for that, it just had this expansive body. So fat.
Yeah.
So sweet. On our table, I found total consistency in the fruits in the cup. I knew it was heavily fruited. A lot of plum and raisin, dark fruit, roast-related fruits, but really well developed. And a little hint of buckwater character too. Yeah, but I don't know. I think it was. And I didn't really get onion.
No,
I bring that down.
main flavors.
Personally, I would agree that it was extraordinarily fat. It was
Extraordinarily
very
fat.
Coffee.
Chewy.
Chewy, and I had very consistent cups. I think there's a better roast place for it for me. For me, this one got more oniony than I wanted it to be, but fruit, there's lots of dark fruit. So.
Anyway, these people really know what they're doing. I mean, they're covering the whole range of the coffee, but it's a collaboration. One suggests fat, the other one picks up, very fat, chewy, and they're teaching each other what the flavor is. And as they teach each other, they can teach me, because I don't know a thing, right? I'm just an ethnographer here. But this work of making their knowledge objective, which they need to do to remember it, to communicate it, and to build it, makes it possible for me to join in. Because they have to exhibit the orderliness and intelligibility of the terms that they're using for each other to use them as effective categories. And as they teach each other, they're teaching me at the same time. All right. Let's see. There may be some objective taste in the cup, but it's not an objectivity in the way that there's a coin in your pocket. It's an objectivity that's more like a figure in the foliage that still needs to be extracted because it's endlessly deep. Let's see. It's not the case that you're drinking the coffee and you're just providing a taste descriptor that's a perfect objective representation, and that your empirical that you're operating in according to proper scientific procedure, according to this myth, really, that everything that's objective is just the coffee doing it for us, as if we're not organizing the meanings, as if we don't play a role in producing the objectivity of the flavors. So, but it's not exactly that the descriptors are producing the description of the coffee. That is, the coffee's not entirely limited to the objective descriptors that we've developed together and are applying to understand it, but rather the coffee can always exceed those objective descriptors. And therefore, the coffee is constantly acting back on the descriptors, and the descriptors develop their full sense and reference in response to what the coffee teaches it by virtue of what the descriptor puts into your head and your tongue to look for in the cup of coffee. So the descriptor is contributing, but it's also its meaning, it's creating a context that tells you more about what the descriptor is. So the descriptor and the cup, that is the account and the context, are each elaborate the other. Okay, so some model of objective knowledge maybe is too simplistic. It's far more complicated. It's part of this, let's call it the hermeneutic circle, right? But it has to, precision is required. It's just because it's not one way, just because the realists are incorrect, and just because the idealists are incorrect, doesn't mean you can't have the precise flavor, because you're going to pay the money. You want the right thing. So you want to study how do you get the right flavor.
Coffee is very good structure, very good body to it.
It's okay. This is in India. She's brilliant.
And in that body is interwoven with the acidic nuances, with brightness.
Okay, she really knows her coffees. And what's interesting is that India has a whole different palette of flavor, and it's becoming a very important part of blends, especially in Sweden, the Indian coffees. The Malabar coffees, especially, are being used in the Swedish blends, and she comes up with this idea of bright, right? But what does bright mean? What can bright mean? Bright was actually a very precise description for the particular coffee. I brought in, she was going to introduce me to the panoply of flavors of Karnataka coffees, but I brought in a coffee, she didn't know what it was, because I wanted to see her work, because she's got a lot of expertise. And she nailed this coffee. But what bright sounds too vague as to be able to make up its mind, right? But it was more than fruity. It was like, I mean, it's not a coffee I would want to drink every day, but it's certainly a coffee that's going to wake you up on one of the days of the week. I mean, it's really good. Some of the Ethiopians are a lot like that. They're like a really high lemon sort of thing. Anyway, this research into the use of descriptors is very interesting, but you can't just ask them, what do the descriptors mean? Because the problem that you have is that everybody wants to give a lecture about their work. If you start off with the designers, tell us about your work, you're going to get a lot of useless stuff. You're going to get a lot of idealizations, which they may believe or they may not believe. There's no difficulty. There's no difficulty whatsoever in believing your own propaganda, right? That happens. But what I wanted was naturally occurring work of coffee tasters. But immediately you come in and they say, well, what am I supposed to do? And I tell them nothing. You're not supposed to do anything. Well, what are you here for then? So you want to be a fly on the wall, ideally. But I have enough experience that you can get coffee tasters using descriptors for their own work. But when I did that, I discovered that they don't use descriptors just for describing the taste. They use descriptors for finding the taste. Without the descriptors, they won't find the depth of flavors that are in the cup. The descriptors are tools that are used in very creative ways. You could say that creativity is objective or subjective. It's not important, but you can't miss the practice of the tasters employing those systems and those descriptors. I mean, they've got their chart, right? They've got their chart on the wall. Here's the flavors in India. Here's the flavors in Brazil. And the Special Coffee Association of America has a beautiful color wheel of all the different flavor categories, not just flavors, but flavors are kind of like apples and oranges. How do you compare bitter with round? And each get the same number, that gets averaged into the total score. And they make everybody has one of these wheels. I've got one on my office wall, right? I mean, they're fascinating and they're helpful. But if you say, well, that's not exactly what the wheel says, they go, forget the wheel. The wheel's news from nowhere, right? So any objective method that's removed itself from the embodied practices of the tasting is, as universally rejected by serious professional tasters. That's why they're so beautiful to study. They really know what they're doing. So we're interested in how they find the taste, and we're interested in how the taste descriptors get their sense and reference, and especially how these defined tastes get stabilized after the people find them. That is, how do they tame the meaning of the descriptors in the same place? That is, in a given setting. And do those descriptors mean the same thing in Savona that they mean in Tokyo? I mean, that's very important. The descriptors then don't stand independently of the work with some isolated meaning already explained like in a dictionary. They function with the taste. They collect their meaning. Syrupy, full body. What is full body? What is balance? That's just amazing. Because you have to balance something, but everybody talks about it in a different way. I still haven't nailed that down. And yet, if you ask someone, they'll give you a definitive answer, but that definitive answer may not be precisely what you find on the film when they start talking about balance in a real cup. Okay. So my thesis then is that the local work of coffee tasters is to manipulate the taste descriptors in a creative way that brings their tongues to confront directly the real objectivity that's in the cup of coffee. I say tongues, but I also mean minds. And Joe Lafelle, my colleague at the Università di Trento, points out to me that in the original Latin, sapere meant not only to know, but to taste. Yeah, in Italian, sapere means to know, and sapore means to taste now. And in fact, the title of our book in Italian is going to be Il sapere del sapore. But that they originally meant the same thing. So the actual meaning of a taste descriptor then has some indeterminacy. You could even say it's necessarily indeterminate, because if it was completely determinate, you couldn't find the next quality of fruitiness that's in the cup. And that's not a problem. It's a problem if you want to subscribe to a scientific view of objectivity. But it's not a problem for practical people needing to find the taste. Rather, the necessary character of the indeterminacy is a resource. And so you see how they use the tasters to develop findings and how they stabilize those understandings so that everybody there understands it in the same way. And then they do their best to communicate it to their buyer in Brazil, and he has to communicate it to the exporters. And they are skilled. Their job is to listen to what these importers want and provide them with it. And do it even with some respect. I mean, like I said, he told me there's no best coffee. Which coffee is the best? What are you talking about? There's just the coffee the client is asking me for. Okay. And so they try to understand, and they use these tools for objectivating their knowledge. And they create their local invariances, but it's an invariance that can change from one cupping to the next. So that's a very interesting kind of invariance. It's as illogical as the notion of the necessary impossibility of objectivity in tasting. And I'd like to track the local history of some of these invariances. So there are plenty of cups of coffee for which a descriptor like smooth, say, can be an adequate description, but they display their smoothness in unique ways and in varying ways. And so this requires continual work by the tasters to coordinate and maintain the meaning in the objective sense of what that term like smooth could possibly mean. So objectivity then is far from being independent. It requires constant supervision, constant coordination, and I'm sure that Goetz, the astronomers that he studied, are constantly coordinating the objective knowledge that they find in the stars as they do their astronomical work. So the descriptors assist us and at the same time can get in the way. So they get frustrated by all these ironies and they say, let's be more objective, let's start enumerating more. And every lab has its own schedule. In Italy they call them schedas. They are protocols for analyzing the coffee, and they're forms that you fill out. And some people advocate really complicated ones, and some people advocate really simple ones. And Jolo's got a whole pile of them. They're really, really interesting. What are the schedules about? And this is very interesting. I'm going to show you now. The schedules are about helping the parties to coordinate their understanding. That is, they more than their value in creating objective things, it helps them to communicate. And there's so many going on. I mean, there's devices for measuring numerically the color of the bean after it's roasted. If we found the right roast level for this particular crop of coffee that gives the flavors that we've decided are going to sell well, how do we keep getting that same roast? Well, you use color photography to do it. But does it work? You have to keep retesting it. Maybe the beans changed a little bit. Or you can count anything. When you roast coffee, there's a first crack, like a popcorn. You know, coffees are beans, and so they pop. But there's also a second crack. And sometimes you don't want to go to the second crack, and sometimes you do. So you start timing how long does it take to get from the first crack to the second crack. At a certain temperature, it might be 3 minutes. At another temperature, it might be 2 minutes. The 2 minutes is giving us the coffee we want. The 3 minutes is not. So you have all these numerical measures, but the point is they're not willing to say, let's just go by the book. They have to constantly taste and retain the final power to make the decision over what works and what doesn't. So, but the numeration has another role, that is the first role of fostering the communication. And I would say that most people in situations, whether you're a neophyte or a professional, you're concerned not to look stupid. I mean, it's all of us. We don't want to look stupid. If you ask a question later, you will want an answer to your question, but even more than that, you'll want not to look stupid, right? And you'll want not to make a mistake. And so I found that people welcome the very objectivity, that is, object in this sense of object. They love the fact that they've got a pen and paper and something to do and scores to write, because it gives them something to do so they won't look stupid. And they can write and record and talk in very professional ways. And so, you know, I was giving to my students tasting exercises and having them go out and film people who think they're really knowledgeable about coffee. A lot of people are in that category. And film them talking about taste. But the discussion was it lacked discipline. I wasn't happy with it. So when I got to Trento, Jolo and I gave the students a very simple protocol, a very simple schedule of quantitative measures.
Equilibrio. Questo è equilibrato, infatti facciamo fatica a dire che è acido, non è acido. Vero? Nel secondo abbiamo messo 7 di equilibrio, nel primo 8, no scusate 5. Quindi c'è più alto? 8. Lo mettiamo equilibrato tanto quanto un secondo o io aumenterei. Mettiamo 9? Sì, sono 9. Il secondo è 7. Ah, 9. Facciamo 9. Sì. Dolcezza?
Now there's a lot of interesting things happening here, but what I want to talk about most is that they pretty much don't know what they're doing. And yet there's a certain confidence with which they're not knowing. And they're evaluating these coffees and deciding what number, and this is like 45 minutes of this, what number each coffee should get according to which category, retrogusto, which is aftertaste, dolcezza, which is sweetness, and they're going. And they're like, never talk about the coffee. They never really convey what's the meaning of sweetness, what's the meaning of balance, what's the meaning of what do you mean aftertaste? Aftertaste now or 10 minutes from now, or and yet they proceed and they fill out this whole pile of forms for each coffee, and it passes as a way to provide for the orderliness of their occasion, so that the work gets done. Unfortunately, no one learns anything about the coffee. And I'm amazed. I was amazed at that. I mean, I wanted the form to make them more disciplined in talking about the taste, and instead they just used the numberings as some abstract exercise that led them away from the taste. And that was unanticipated. And then I went back and looked at some of the professional tasters, and I discovered, oh, these really brilliant guys, they're scared too. They're starting with the numbers, and maybe it's a place to start. And there's some objectivity to the numbers because they're reproducing similar kinds of numbers on a 100-point scale. But
I'm going to hold in start with 2226. How many people had this less than 80? Okay. 80 to 85. Anybody over 85? Nobody over 90?
so they are actually leaning on the numerating practice as a crutch to sort of find out, before you say what you think, where's the gist of the room, right? And the problem is, sometimes they get to really detailed discussion of what the flavor is, but sometimes they just settle for the numbers. And if I can contribute anything to them, it's to how to do the numbering without having it substitute for the actual understanding. Garfinkel has this graph where he puts up context-dependent expression. That's the indexicality of expressions. And our job as everyday organizers of orderliness in society is to substitute for context-dependent expressions, context-free expressions. Okay? And that's part of the work that they're doing. But you can be so context-free that you cannot have tasted anything at all. It's not the case in these professional tasters, but still they're really heavily using the numerating as an avoidance strategy. We can say then, more broadly speaking, that in addition to accomplishing whatever practical tasks are being faced, whether you're building an airplane or designing a toy, doing science, defining a coffee's taste, the parties are oriented to finding and stabilizing an orderliness to assist them in getting their work done, and also, to make sure that they don't do it in any untoward ways. I don't want to psychologize people's obsessions with order, but they do need to get on the same page in order to accomplish anything. And so we need to describe that work of their getting on the same page. Let's say only that creating a local orderliness reduces the ambiguity of the situation and makes it less likely that people get into trouble. There's a preference in many situations for objectivity because it's safer. There's a preference for objectivity because it provides a ready-made way to organize the orderliness. And not necessarily because of just a concern for truth or a sense of scientific discipline, although that can be part of it also. Because objective standards and objective methods make it plain and evident what each party must do in order to get through the interaction successfully. In my study of the Tibetan practices of reasoning, I think I effectively in the book demonstrated that among the many things that logic is, it's an organizational tool that parties use to communicate clearly. And they do a better job of it than our philosophers do at our conferences, I can tell you. I mean, very impressive. But the logic has liabilities in putting people into straitjackets that later they need to think their way through. But it does allow people to make their thinking collaborative. That is, logic has a social function as well as a scientific one. Parties can and will use whatever is at hand to organize a local orderliness. In the case of coffee tasters, everyone uses some kind of schedule. Well, there was one guy in Brazil who had a principle of refusing, but almost everybody. Even tasters who don't trust schedules use them. And you find in Italy, they're really insistent on very detailed schedules. In India, they don't like schedules and they're very simplified. They don't trust them, which is very interesting. And there are cultural variations, of course. Having a physical thing and something to do, which is what filling out a schedule provides, allows you to collaborate in a way that makes all the collaboration predictable, and it lets you to get on your way even when the routines aren't all that useful, and even when the parties still don't know what they're doing at the end of it. And the routines, and here's a big point which I'm not going to talk about today, partly because I haven't demonstrated it to my satisfaction in my research, but these routines are not thought up in advance. They have a very serendipitous character. They come upon them by accident. And having come upon them, they stick with them because they seem to work. But the mindlessness of them and the serendipity of them has me just absolutely astonished at this stage. And so I need more film to see how these ways of organizing the local orderlinesses come into vogue without anyone really knowing exactly what's going on. That is to say, when I was reading your Spire document, there was a phrase there, the collective process of sense-making, which is pretty much the topic that I'm examining in these studies. And there was some awareness, I think, in my at least how I read your document, that you realize that sense-making is in part a social process, and the results may have less to do about sense and more to do about the contingencies of the local interaction. And of course, I'm also impressed that a lot of it is mimesis. But we talk in terms of sense. Another comment in your document, and sorry if this is old news for you, but all your stuff is quite new to me. There's a phrase that says, conversation can create and refine ideas, but might as well dilute them in joint agreement. That's just a fascinating statement. How do ideas get diluted beneath the regime of a local orderliness for that joint agreement? I mean, that's really an important topic, and things get really crazy. Let me just give you a hypothetical instance. And of course, we're battling upstairs, downstairs we have the economics department, and upstairs we have the political science department, and they're both stuck into this rational choice theory, which I'm convinced has a career only because it provides careers for the people who write that way. Let's say there's three people trying to make sense of a situation, and person A offers an account. Oh, well, here's what's going on. Maybe it's figuring out how a game works. Here's what's going on. And the second person says, yeah, you're right. And then they offer a repetition of the account, which makes it clear to person A that person B has misunderstood what he meant. But he's very enthusiastic with his agreement, and that confirmation carries with it some social obligation. And person C doesn't really understand what A or B is talking about, but thinks if A and B are in agreement, I don't want to be left out. So there's a kind of gratuitous nod that goes on. And right at that point, A was about to interrupt and says, no, that's not what I mean. But since C's nodding his head, and B and C, and they seem to understand themselves, A goes along with what he understands is the evident meaning of B's misunderstanding of his original proposal. So they all agree, and that becomes the rule of the game. And it's never a rule that any one of them had an interest in advocating. Okay? I mean, C doesn't even know what the rule is still. Right? So this is more like what happens in the real world. And if the methodology has the oats to find these kinds of phenomena. I mean, if the world's crazy and illogical, sorry, NEH, but that's just the way it is. I'm being more scientific than people pretend that things are more organized than they really are. Like if people don't know what they're doing, how do they apply rational choice theory, right? So, I mean, but you can't just reflect. You've got to get your data and let the craziness of the world guide you. Okay, am I running out of time?
10 minutes more.
10 minutes more. Let me just briefly mention, I won't go into the tapes on it. The numerating practices are really interesting in that you think that the number would reflect something that's in like there, like in the data, that the number comes right from the copy. Oh, this is a 7. Oh, this is a 5. And especially when you're not saying anything else about the taste except giving it a number. Oh, I mean, maybe sweetness, you can say 7 is sweeter than 5, but balance, smoothness, just exactly, how many different ways are there of being smooth? And is there too smooth? I mean, when does bland start being rated below or higher? I mean, it's a very troubling thing. And Émile Peynaud, this author of The Taste of Wine, writes, the case where there's only one glass and only one wine to taste is a difficult taste because the taster has to judge the wine solely on the basis of the information given and with no other reference points. Tasting is of use only if it makes comparisons. Unless the wine is marked positive or negative characteristics, one should not expect detailed and positive information from tasting isolated samples. And there is this phenomenon then of triangulation. You don't know what the first cup really is. You don't know what number to give it. You don't know what those numbers mean until you taste the second cup. Well, this is more of whatever that was than this is. So this was a lot, let's say burned. This is a 9, and this one is less burned, so let's give it a 7. Until you taste the third one, and that's even more burned than the first one. So and these are on the tape, but we'll save time with this summation. So you demote the 9 to a 7, and then demote the 7 to a 5, and after you've done enough cups, you've got a nice order, and then you stabilize that order in the social work that you do together. And then you have and then everybody's going to say, no, we're doing it objectively, But I noticed on the film that there's very heavy use of the eraser end of the pencils. Okay, what are they doing with all this erasing? I know what they're doing. They've got this elaborate schedule, and they've done this and done this and done this and done this and added it up and averaged it and deducted the penalties, and they've come up with a score that's too low for that great coffee, or too high. And so they immediately change the score. That's the first thing they erase. And then they go back. You do this in your grading. Right? You know, that previous answer wasn't as good as I was willing to give you credit when I thought you were about to flunk. You know, now that you've come back, I'm going to adjust so that it adds up in an objective way to the right score. Well, that right score comes from where? It comes from, Husserl would say, it comes from the evidence of original insight, which has its own authority, which maybe needs to trump. I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon, especially that they could do so many cups of coffee without ever discussing what the numbers mean. And yet the numbers were self-organizing by the end of it, but not certainly at the beginning of it. So studying these tasting cards is something that we're really interested in doing. They're really, the tasting card is like a classic account of tasting, but their validity and efficacy is dependent upon the act of local work of the tasters to maintain the plausibility of their accurate assessment of coffees. And they want them, but what are they good for? The tasting schedules really are systematic enough that they require the tasters to explore every aspect of the taste and not get locked into too narrow of a perspective. So the tasting cards are great, but they're not great necessarily for what the tasters think they're great for. That is, it's not just that now we can be rigorous. Yeah, it's a kind of rigor, but what is rigor? Rigor is the ability to break through your thinking as well as the ability to keep it organized. And you need quite a sophisticated tongue and mind in order to do that. So that's where the serious work of professional tasters is located. And so you don't want to be too quick to just stop with the numbers. You want to do that serious work. Okay, let me finish with a highfalutin theoretical discussion. I'm all for theory. I love my phenomenology, and I might be alone in my field. Not exactly, but I'm persistent, maybe the most persistent. I think when you've done your research, you can see how you fit into what other people have said. You shouldn't start with the research. Well, you can start with an idea, but you need to be moved by the studies and the data that you find, and then wait until the end to make all the theoretical connections. Oh, yeah, I did want to show you that. This shows you the kind of cockamamie-ness that happens. The coffee's bold. It's bold. It's definitely bold. Okay? You want to be aware of any time somebody uses the word definitely. Okay? It's definitely bold. And then A repeats, it's a very bold coffee, so they've objectivated this category bold. But have they understood what it means? What does bold mean? I mean, the person who says it's definitely bold, you can see on the tape, dives into the cup. Okay, I better find out what bold is pretty quick here. And then he says again, I definitely agree with the boldness. So the tapes go on, and later on B says it was really sour, bitter, too strong, but bold. And then the interviewer, well, one of my students, purportedly innocently, but I told them to be confounding whenever they could. What do you mean by bold, right? And B says he was the one that how is bold, right? Okay. I want to talk about Adorno. I'm in a phase where I'm enthralled with negative dialectics, which is his last great work. forgive my, and you can indulge me a bit. The problem is, generally speaking, any operative ideology that thinks that the way to achieve objectivity is to remove all subjectivity. And only when you remove the subjectivity do you have what's left as objectivity. Well, if you remove the subjectivity, you haven't got anything left at all, right? You got a bunch of numbers that mean nothing. So, in fact, in order to get to what's objective, you need an active subjective practice. Real objectivity is produced by people whose subjectivity is really rigorous and tuned to careful analysis and communication and reassessment of what it is they're developing. And so you can't, it's not that simplistic. There's no subjectivity without objectivity. There's no objectivity without subjectivity. So the way that we're thinking about objectivity, and this is a big issue for people in the coffee industry, is important. Conformity with an ideology of science can be a form of sentimentalism and not objective analysis. As I said, real objectivity is what's in the cup. And real objectivity is a term I lifted right out of Adorno. But professional tasters want it both ways, or as an Italian taster told me, they want the maximum objective expression of subjectivity. They want it both ways because they need it both ways. And this is a problem that Adorno addresses. What he refers to as the real objectivity differs from the methodologically provided objectivities. Real objectivity is the flavor in the cup, right? That's the real objectivity in the cup. That's the methodologically derived objectivity. And the mistake is to see this as the only objectivity in the room. And coffee tasters don't make that mistake. Only a few. That's why I like studying them. Because they have to get the right taste. So Adorno writes that the structure of an objective mode of thought is no longer imposed on it by the authority and sovereignty with which it creates and generates its objects from within itself, but by the shape of whatever confronts it. An objectivity has to confront, say, the flavor in the cup. You can't just have your knowledge so rigorously organized that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that won't be objectivity worthy of the name. In Adorno's words, the objectivity heteronymous to the subject, the objectivity behind that, which the subject can experience, is where objectivity comes from. Yet it's an objectivity that confronts any formal practice of understanding. When the object of understanding keeps disrupting the monologue of formal analytic understanding that's sure of itself, it's very inconvenient. And anyone, lay or professional, is resistant. But for anyone seeking objective knowledge, that's science, and that's the point of Adorno's book, Negative Dialectics. Methodologically provided objectivities are the professionally accepted and agreed upon practices for managing the demonstration of objective expressions. These forms of objectivity, though, are artifacts even when they're efficacious. And so it is the very essence of these kinds of objectivities to be subjective. A lot of factory owners would like to buy the methods and implement them with certainty that they'll be right. But the tasters who work for them have to disabuse them of those easy solutions, because finding the right flavor is extremely complicated indeed. And by right flavor, I mean, in this case, the objective quality to the flavor. So Adorno says that there can be such a preoccupation with fulfilling the requirements of correct methods that the real objectivity will be overlooked. He says that the activity breaks men of the habit of experiencing the real objectivity to which they're subjected. And practitioners of received methodologies even miss the fact that they've missed it. And you know, social science is not excluded here at all. So it seems that real objectivity has a subjectivity that has to be retained, and this this citation of Adorno is enough to make me dance like a dakini. I don't know if you know what a dakini is. Adorno says the notions of subjective and objective have been completely reversed. Objective means the non-controversial aspect of things, their unquestioned impression, the facade made up of classified data, that is the subjective. Because a methodology is a production of people. So it's a subjective phenomenon. And they call subjective anything which breaches that facade, that doesn't remain confined by the prison of the objective methodology. Cast off already made judgments and substitutes for relatedness to the object, that's Husserl's evidence. The majority consensus of those who do not even look at it, let alone think about it, right? They're the sociologists that never leave their office to study anybody. They're just downloading data sets, okay? That is, they do not even look at it, let alone think about it. In other words, the objective itself. That is, to look at it is what's objective. To think about it in the presence of what you're analyzing is objective. It's not subjective, even if it transgresses the formal constructs of the discipline. Just how vacuous the formal objection to subjective relativity is can be seen. So I say, bravo, Adorno. So now my task then is to be guided, really. My task is to be guided by these professional coffee tasters who do it right. And what can that inform us about how to do science, about how to think, how to get control of these formal analytic systems that are confounding cardiologists and airplane pilots, right? So anyway, that's the talk.